So what happened to the Hupmobile crankshaft? I thought the easiest way to show people would be a quick video. So it's a 3-main bearing engine, and the front main is a single piece, slides over the snout of the crank, and that's also important when grinding this crank, because obviously you cannot cut a step in here and be able to slide that bearing on. So when this is ground, it has to be ground right off of the end, which starts to get into this taper that this 30-pound flywheel mounts on. So the more we take the journal undersized, eventually it's going to start sitting too deep into the taper here and create a problem with mounting the flywheel. So we're limited there. No way to cut a step. Maybe a person could shim it. I'd rather not. So we're kind of as small as we can go at 20 under without getting into flywheel taper trouble. So that's one problem with even trying to correct what's already been done. Center main, standard 2-piece. And as the crank goes in through the front of the engine block, you can actually change the crankshaft with the engine and transmission in the car by removing the side plate, disconnecting the rods, and pulling it out of the front. So these get installed as the crank goes into their center location, held with a couple through studs to pull everything together. And then this front slides over the snout. Now the third main is unique. It's not actually a journal on the shaft. The third main is the front of this clutch hub, which then slides into the third main of the engine and engages to the tail of that crankshaft with 2 keyways. What happened is this main and this main are not ground in line with the rear, which you obviously can't grind. It needs to be the proper size to engage in that hub. And he thought he would be okay to indicate around these keyways. In hindsight, I really wish I had insisted on bringing this hub so the crank could be assembled, and maybe even put this in the chuck of the crank grinder and leave it assembled, indicate, zero in on this, and grind the other two to match, because that is running about 5 thousandths eccentric to the third main. I mean, if a person had to, I suppose you could even grind this and grind it all together, but I'd rather not take material off this. It's still round, it's true, it's in great shape. I'd rather preserve that, and just, I see no reason it couldn't be indicated in to zero run out and the other journals cut. I especially don't want to grind this now that the Babbitt work is done. I would have to re-pour and redo this complete rear bearing. If we try to correct the offset by grinding the front two, I would need to figure out the flywheel taper issue and then redo the center Babbitt and this. It may not look like much sitting here, but there's quite a lot of work that goes into these, scraping in their fit to the caps, doing all the oil grooving, oil holes, chamfers, flanges, getting the width exactly correct on the flanges. The same here, there's actually oil return, keyways cut into the OD of this one before it's pressed in, oil return grooving, quite a lot of work. And Babbitt is not cheap anymore. I mean, I can remelt that, but you're going to lose a certain percentage every time, and you want a certain percentage of new material to, keep all of the elements up. You get some oxidation every time you heat, and the material starts to move away from its ideal percentages of copper, tin, other elements. The thrust is handled. People reading, if you're watching this video, linked from the belt thread. These are some of the thrusts that were made. The crank does not handle the thrust when the clutch is depressed. That's handled at the back of the engine block. There's going to be a hardened steel plate put on here to take up the wear, and the aluminum bronze there. This is actually the release bearing for the clutch here. Then this goes on into the transmission input shaft. So a little bit of a different setup. So I think at this point that crankshaft is not going to be used. There might be some repair options to hard chrome that up, maybe even weld it, but for a crankshaft that's already not known for its strength, I hate to keep cutting it smaller. I hate to induce heat, weld on it. Maybe a chroming process, but at some point, if we can get these new crankshafts made, that's the route I'm going to take. So hopefully this answers some questions about what happened, and I'm looking forward to putting this together. With the new crank, I'll have to reset up my line bore. This bearing is done. This fits excellent. These two will need to get taken out to factory size, so I'll need to take another 20 thousandths out of each of these, which I don't think will take all of my oil grooving out. I may have to go and deepen some of those, but I mean, at least I can go bigger. I can't go smaller without repouring everything. And really, I suppose having a new crankshaft at the end of the day is not a bad thing. The company that crowned that has done many crankshafts for me. I'm not really putting the blame on them. I think it's just it's different, and I wish I would have spent more time explaining expectations and what it needed to be. I think a lot of people also think these old cars are sloppy and it's good enough, and if anything, the tolerance in this is much more tight and precise in this part of the vehicle than a modern vehicle. Other areas are, a mile away from modern tolerances, but this is one part of most old cars that is pretty needs to be pretty good. And if that's not in line, that crank has to bend every time it turns, and I think that's why a lot of them break. A lot of people blame the heavy flywheel at the front, which is a factor. All of that stored energy is a twisting force through the entire length of the crank. Every time you let the clutch out, if you step on the brakes without declutching, I mean, normally the flywheel's at the back and the crank is not subjected to as much of the force of that flywheel. But anyway, that's the parts for the lower end of the 1911 Hupmobile, and a little bit of a setback. Hopefully in a few months the new crank is ground up and we're putting this thing together, because the rest of it is just about ready to go. Thanks, guys.